If you didn't get one of these, again, I got a stack of them over by the chair, and there was some floating around over here. It's going to save time as we go through the beginning part of my presentation here. There's just, frankly, too much information PowerShell-wise to go over in 60 minutes. I actually thought I had 75, so I had to somehow compress this another 15. So, but this you take with you. I'm going to put this up on my blog as well in a PDF, so if you want to print out some at home. But the hope was that you could kind of pin this on your cubicle wall or something. But I know myself, my memory's not all that great, so this has actually been quite helpful for me. So make sure you're in the right room. This is Windows PowerShell Best Practices for SharePoint 2010 Administrators. About me, my name is Gary Lapointe. I'm a SharePoint MVP, obviously from the States. I run my own company, Fulton Consultant. I'm also a co-founder of Aptilon Incorporated. So some of you may be familiar with it. So there's 7 of us within the community, MVPs, MCMs, MCM trainers, that form this consortium. So if I can't help you as an individual, my team at Aptilon, one of us or some of us may be able to help you out. So again, I do a lot of PowerShell, but I also do a lot of dev work, planning, architecture, kind of the full gambit. So if you need help with your project, my contact information is there, and I'll put this up at the end of the talk as well. So quick agenda, and I apologize, I'm going to go fairly fast through some of this. Like I said, there's a lot of information. I'm going to try to get to as much as I can. But I wanted to start off by sort of level setting and going over some PowerShell basics, kind of see where everybody's at. And then we'll go through some common tasks. So I have 6 of them planned. 2 of them I've already blogged about. So if you've read it on my blog, they should be familiar. So depending on where the room is at, I may just kind of glance over those and cover the stuff that is not really documented out there very well. And then hopefully I'll have time to get into some PowerShell remoting. So what I need to do first off is kind of get a measure of the room and see where everybody's at. Is there anybody here who has never used PowerShell? So a couple. So how about you used PowerShell but don't know anything about the SharePoint side of it? Few. So the rest of you have been using it quite a while with SharePoint, fairly grounded. Okay. So I'm going to go through the 101 stuff pretty quickly then. So my apologies to those that are new, but hopefully you'll get through some, you'll figure some things out as I go along, but don't worry about coming up and afterwards and asking me questions. I'll try to explain as much as I can. But hopefully, like I said, these cheat sheets, these are the things that tripped me up the most when I started, so hopefully that'll kind of get you ahead as well. All right. So kind of PowerShell 101, just really quick, just to kind of make sure we're using the same terms here. Everybody familiar with STS-ADM, 2007, STS-ADM commands, right? So STS-ADM-O backup site, right? So if we correlate that to PowerShell, drop the STS-ADM-O backup site. I got -URL and then an URL value. Well, that backup site is now backup-SB site. That's a commandlet. So forget command, it's a commandlet. I have parameters. They're going to be dash, some sort of name, and then a value. They can be named like that, or they can be positional. I can also pass in parameters to my commandlets via what's known as a pipeline. So think of a pipeline as just an assembly line where I have things that go from one station and move to the next station. And along the way, I'm modifying them somehow. I may be limiting the results that come back. I may be modifying the actual objects or whatnot. So with STS-ADM, you've got a collection of commands. If you correlate that to PowerShell, I have a snap-in. So with SharePoint, we have the Microsoft.SharePoint.PowerShell snap-in. And that is the collection of all the available commandlets that are specific to SharePoint. And these commandlets themselves may be defined in multiple .NET assemblies, but there's sort of one gateway assembly that controls all that. So it's not important to understand the back-end details. That's tomorrow's talk. But just understand that if you want the commandlets to be available, you have to load the snap-in. In STS-ADM, if you want to sort of put together a bunch of commands, you'd create a batch file, so .bat or .cmd. PowerShell, you're going to have a PS1, right? It's a script. So key terms. When you want to work with PowerShell and SharePoint, the most common place is to go to the SharePoint 2010 management shell. So all this is just a PowerShell executable. So it's the PowerShell console window. You can see that here with the PowerShell.exe. And we're just preloading a script called SharePoint PS1. All that guy does is load the snap-in for us. It also sets the threading model. It's a little bit more on the advanced side, deals with disposal issues and memory management. If there's time at the end, ask me about that, I'll get into that. But the important piece is that it loads the snap-in, so you don't have to do that yourself. But you're not limited to using the management shell. You can use any script editor. So the standard Windows PowerShell 2 console, Power GUI, the Windows ISE, the ISE rather, the integrated scripting environment. In fact, I never use the management shell. So I use Power GUI or the Windows ISE most of the time, or just a standard console. So, but I also don't load those snap-in manually every time, because that's kind of a pain. So what I do, and this would be sort of my first best practice, if you will, would be to create a script that will go ahead and update my, it's called a profile script for me. So whenever you open any kind of editor, it's going to go ahead and run this thing called a profile script automatically for you. So this one's a little bit more complicated in that I put this in a file, a script, and whenever I am building a new SharePoint server, I run this guy as part of the provisioning process. So this is going to go ahead and test. So it's going to look at the profile variable there. It'd be easier for me to do this. So it's going to look at this profile variable here. And this all users, all hosts property on that variable. It's going to check that using the test path commandlet. So if the file does not exist, oh, sorry. Okay, don't really know what's happening there. Now, see, I just gave away all my slides. All right, mouse is dead. Sorry about that. All right, let's try that again. Okay, sorry. If the file doesn't exist, it's going to go ahead and create it. And the important piece here is between lines 4 and 10. So it's going to take that script block and put it in the file using the set content commandlet. So don't worry about what this is doing right now. The key piece is that it is loading the snap-in for me automatically and setting the thread options as well. So my deck and everything will be available, I think, as part of the DVD, and I'll also have it on my blog, so don't worry about trying to write all this down, and don't worry if you don't understand everything that's going on right now. I'll kind of build on this so that when you look back at it, it'll make some sense. So the next thing you need to understand is what permissions do I need in order to connect, to use the PowerShell commandlets. So everybody here just logs in as domain admin, right, and you're good to go. Farm admin. Yeah, so you don't really worry about this. So if you're a dev, that would be the case. But if you're security conscious, you need to be aware of this. You're not going to go and make everybody a local administrator on your machine and give them full rights to the entire farm. At least you shouldn't be. So the key point is that you need to be a member of the WSS admin WPG local security group on each server that you're going to execute PowerShell from. And then you also need to be in the SharePoint Shell Access SQL Server role. And by default, that role only exists on the configuration database. It doesn't exist on the other databases. But you don't add that manually. You use the add SP shell admin commandlet to do it. So in the first example in line 1, I'm calling add SP shell admin, passing in the username, providing my user, and that's going to add them to that local group on all the servers in my farm. It's key. And to the SharePoint Shell Access role on the configuration database only. If I need access to a specific content database, for instance, so maybe I want to be able to allow somebody to pull site collections from a particular content database, I can provide that database name, as I do on lines 3 and 4, along with the username. If I want to, say, do more than one database, I can, here I'm getting a collection of all the databases that SharePoint knows about. I'm piping that to the where object commandlet. So I'm going to say, give me all my databases and give me just a subset of those based on this name pattern. So just the ones that start with SharePoint_demo. So I'm using a wildcard there to filter them. I then take that result set, pass it into the add SP shell admin commandlet, and along with the username as well. Some commands will require additional privileges. So for instance, new SP web application. So if you want to create a web application, you need to be a local administrator and a farm admin. So usually, though, it's just the setup-related stuff. So if you're provisioning service applications, that kind of stuff, those are the ones that are going to require that higher-level access. If you're doing this just temporarily, you just need to assign somebody access for just a period of time while they do some operations. You can remove access using the remove SPShell admin commandlet. And the syntax is exactly the same as the add. But the big caveat here is it does not remove from that WPG group, the WSS admin WPG group. So this is by design. There's some good reasons for it, although I think they're kind of cop-out reasons. But it is by design. But in my mind, it's a security hole. So another best practice, don't ever assign users directly this way. Create an AD group, and where you see domain user, do a group name instead. So that way, through AD, you can add and remove users from there. And what you may do is, in fact, create multiple groups, because what you eventually do is use a remote in, and now I can define different levels of access. So there's some tricks you can do with remote, and where I can say, yeah, they can connect, they can run these, just the subset of commandlets. So I don't have to expose the entire spectrum of all the available commandlets. So if you create an AD group, add and remove users from there, you do this once, and then you don't have to touch it again. So this is not as big a deal if you've got a small farm. Here, a single server farm on my laptop, or 2 or 3 box, not as big a deal, but I've got some clients with 20, 30, 40 servers in their farm. It's kind of annoying to have to go to every single server. So. All right, so quick demo. If I can find my demo machine. So let me ask this before I start. So for those of you that have had a chance to look at the cheat sheet, is there anything that stands out as confusing that you'd want some particular emphasis on? So I got a couple things that I'm going to go through, but I want to make sure that everybody is clear on what's in front of them. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, don't worry. So once, twice, okay, cool. So what I want to show really quick, and this is just a couple things that have tripped a few people up that I know, is some of the things around escape characters and sub-expressions, hash tables, arrays, that kind of stuff. So the first thing I want to show is the common thing. You're going to define a password in a string. So if I do something like this, this is just going to output it. Notice that what gets outputted is not what I entered, right? So $$ is a key variable, basically. It's called an automatic variable, and it represents the last token that was created. So right before coming here, I entered CLS to clear the screen, and that's what got entered here. So if I want the actual value, I need to use the backtick to escape it. So now you can see this is actually what I entered. So what if now I want to do something a little bit more dynamic? Let's create a date variable. I'm going to use the getDate commandlet, and I can see what that looks like here. So I just output that to the console. That's basically just doing a toString on it and entering the common format. You can see I'm still on Colorado time on my demo machine here. But what if I want to add the year to it? All right, so I'm going to do date.year. So if I take my password, I'm just going to do WORD, just standard like that. So if I do just this, date.year, I'm going to get the toString equivalent .year, right? So that doesn't really work. Well, if you're a C-sharper, then you might think, okay, no problem, I'm just going to do this. Right? So that'll work, that's cool. But you can also do something what's called a sub-expression. So what I'm going to do is, it's kind of like order of operation in math, right? So I'm going to take a $, open paren, close paren, and anything I enter in those parentheses is going to be evaluated before it gets appended to the string. So now I can do date.year. Right? So sub-expressions is just one of those weird little things that some people have trouble with, but once you get it, it makes a little more sense. So the escape character, though, is not just for escaping special characters like the $, it's also used for escaping the new line character. So if I do something like getSP site, and I want the, let's say I want the identity here, the parameter, for whatever reason, to appear on a new line, I'll use the backtick, and I can indent if I want. So you'll see this a lot in scripts to make things a little more readable, so I'm not extending the line way down the row. So it's a kind of a quick basic one. So the next thing I wanted to show is a hash table. So I'm going to try to point out some of the things that you're going to see in my other scripts so it'll make a little more sense. So in PowerShell, you can define a hash table pretty easily. So I'm going to create a new variable. So all variables start with a $. And here I'm going to define a hash table. So a hash is defined by the little @ an open and a closed curly brace. Now what I can do is I can define any kind of key value pairs separated by a semicolon. Right? So if I do that and then output the results of that, you can see I have now a row for each value in that collection. Right? So I can also append to it. So I can say, you know, I want to add another key to this. So I'm going to use the plus equal operator, and I want, actually I don't even need the parens here. Oops. So one thing you notice, I'm hitting tab and it's cycling through the commands. So I always forget to hit the extra I to give me just the sites. If I do that, oops, forgot to define it as a hash. Right, so here I want site equals that. Right, so this is I'm basically taking an existing hash table and I'm appending another hash table to it. So. Right, so now if I output my hash table, you'll see I've got an entry for that. And it's not in the order they were created, right? This is almost kind of arbitrary. It's right in the middle. So the cool thing, though, where this comes into play and where I use it a lot is in reporting. So a lot of times you want to build a report based on various data. Right? So what you can do is use a hash table to aggregate all your different properties, but you don't want it viewed like this because you're going to have multiple objects in there. So what I want is each object to be a row. So what I need to do is pivot this hash table. So the way you do that is you're going to use the new object commandlet, and you're going to create a new object that is of type PS object. Right? And you notice case doesn't matter here too, by the way. So I can do this. It's the same thing. So it's not C#, it's case insensitive. And then I'm going to set the property and give it the hash that I created. So now when that gets outputted to the console, you see it's pivoted it. So now my keys are now columns. So this is really useful when you're iterating a site collection or list or whatever it may be, and you need to show information in aggregate, basically. So I'll show you a couple of examples where I'm building an inventory of documents throughout my farm. Right? So I do this, add a whole mess of information, pivot it, and then I could export this out to an Excel spreadsheet or something like that and do further manipulations with it. So the next thing I wanted to show, should make sure I'm on the right set here, is arrays. So an array is just a collection of information, right? So here I can create an array by simply comma separating the values. So if I look at this guy, if I can type and get the type on it, you'll see that the base type is array, and it's just an object array. So I can very easily create arrays. This is really useful when you're working with enum values. So anybody developer in the room here? Yeah, okay, lots of you, wow, okay. So great, so you guys know all about this, right? So if I'm dealing with base permissions, it's an enumerator with the flags on it, right? So in C#, if I want to add a set of permissions up, I got to use a bunch of binary OR operations. Not so with PowerShell. All I do is just append it. So I can create, modify, or I forget what the permissions are now, but create web or create webs or modify web or whatever. I can just create an array with the actual name and set that to my permission modifier, and it understands that. It'll do the conversion automatically. So PowerShell has something built in called an adaptive type system. So it looks at what the target type is supposed to be, it looks at what the source is, and if it can figure out how to do the conversion, it does it. So a simple thing like an XML string, for instance, I can do, so this is an alias for system.xml.xml document. Right. So now if I get the type on that, you'll see it's actually an XML type. So I took a string and it dynamically converted it to an XML document for me. So there's a ton of that stuff going on that saves a lot of time when you're dealing with core types within SharePoint. I guess that's another important piece, is that PowerShell, everything in PowerShell is a .NET object. So if you can do it in C#, you can do it in PowerShell, but there's a lot of stuff built in to make things a little easier, the pipeline, for instance, whatnot. So the last thing I wanted to show real quick was, okay, so you know all this, so what about finding the commandlets? How do I figure out what's available for me to use? So the first thing is we have something called get command. So this is also aliased as GCM. So whether I run GCM or get command, it's the same thing. It's just a shorthand. And I can say, give me all the commandlets related to SP site. So this is going to go ahead and list out all the commandlets that I can do related to SP site. There's additional parameters I can pass to get command to do some filtering. I can say just show me ones based on a specific noun or verb. So note that all the commandlet names are verb-noun. Some of these don't actually exist out of the box. These are mine available. So like convert to SP site is something I wrote. So it's getting more into the dev one, but you can extend, obviously. So you found your commandlet. How do I get help on it? Simple. You can type help, the commandlet name. It'll bring up some details on it. Don't rely too much on this. The help documentation is abysmal. So it's really bad. So if some of you didn't know, I've got a book that I actually just finished writing the last chapter on a couple weeks ago. So the book will be out June 13th. That's what I heard this morning, actually. So it's like a 750-page behemoth. Covers a lot of stuff, tons of examples. A lot of what I'm going to be going through in here is covered in there, and then just tons of stuff that you can't find documented anywhere else. So it's been a love-hate relationship working on that book. So, but anyways, you get some details here. There's no parameter descriptions. If you want them, simply add -full, and it'll give you the parameter descriptions as well. So there are some examples in there, and some of the help documentation is good enough to help get you started, but there's a lot of cases where there's parameters that are documented that don't exist, or the name is wrong, or they talk about like web applications when they really mean sites and that kind of stuff. So there's just a lot of inaccuracies and whatnot. So once you have the help, maybe you've gotten an object back. So I've said, okay, get SP site, demo. Now I want to find out what can I do with that site object. So as developers, you can go to the SDK, I can open Reflector, I can go to Visual Studio, there's all kinds of different things I can do to see what's available. Some editors have IntelliSense like PowerGUI, but even PowerGUI, the IntelliSense doesn't kick in until you run something so that it understands what that object is. So here I can pass this result into the getMember commandlet, which is aliased as GM. So this is going to give me a list of all the properties and methods. So if you're not all that familiar with the SharePoint API, this is a great way to understand what you can do. And I'm reasonably familiar with the API, and I still find things by doing this every once in a while that I didn't realize you could do. So, so it's a great way to discover additional stuff that you can do well beyond what the commandlets that are available. So there's over 500 commandlets that are available. I've got 50 that I've released with mine, 50-something. I got another 100 and something planned, sort of spec'd out that I haven't released yet. So there's just a ton of commandlets. But there's so many more classes and other things that you can do all through PowerShell. Usually when you get to that level, though, you're writing scripts, not so much in the command line like we are here. But I'll show you some of that in just a minute, actually. All right, so that's my really quick PowerShell 101. Most of you, it seems like, he kind of has a dev background already, so hopefully between the cheat sheet and what I've quickly pointed out here, that should get you going. But is there any quick questions before I move on to the next bit? Yeah? All right. So common tasks, like I said, I've got 6 scenarios that I've kind of planned to go over, broken into 2 groupings, so reporting and maintenance. The first one I want to talk about here is related to size. So this is how, when I go into a lot of clients and look at their site collections databases, this is usually the first image that comes to mind. So it's really valuable stuff, right, that they've got filling up. So I had an HR person recently who had a little slideshow running on the homepage of her site, and the images were driven off the full high-res prints, 600 DPI, massive images. She had hundreds of them in there, and they were wondering why this page was taking so long to load, and she's cycling images through like every 3 seconds, so it's trying to suck all that down. So one of the challenges you have is, where is the bloat? So You can go to the SQL guys and find out how big your databases are, but you don't always want to nag them. Sometimes you want to be able to just go in and say, how big is my database? Once I got that, how big are the site collections within that database? How big are my sites? How big are the lists and whatnot? How many items in the list in this particular site? So if we come back to our demo machine here, so what I've got is a script here, some examples that I'm going to kind of iteratively build through, but this is sort of the end result. So the first thing I want to talk about is just figuring out how big my databases are. So if I do get SP database, I can get those results back there, and not all that useful. But if I do a get member on this, I'll see that there's a property called disk size required. So if I select that, so this is the select object commandlet, alias to select, and what I want is the name and disk size required. So this tells me now how big each of those databases are. So not exactly, but the disk size required is how much disk space is going to be required to back up this content database. So there's no way to get the exact size right from here without going and connecting to the SQL Server and all that, but this is usually a good enough approximation to tell you where the bloat is. So, but this is in bytes, and my math ain't so good, so I can't really convert that off the top of my head. So what I want to do is use an expression. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another hash table here, and I'm going to give it a script block. So everything in between these two curly braces here is called the script block. So again, creating a hash table just like I created before, but it's only going to have two keys, expression and label. Expression is the only one that's required. If you try to add more, it'll fail. If you try to use a different value, it'll fail. So what I want here is the current object. So $_ is it's called an automatic variable. It represents the current object in the pipeline. So as this pipeline is running, it's iterating through each object. $_ is how I get it. So now what I want is disk size required, and I don't want it in bytes, I want it in megabytes. So I'm going to divide it by 1 megabyte. So MB, GB, I think there's a TB, I don't remember now, but it's just a shorthand that will get me the amount of bytes in a megabyte or in a gigabyte or whatever. So I can take this result, divide it by 1 megabyte, and that'll convert the results to megabytes. So now I want to add a label. We'll call it size. And I want to take these results and I want to sort them by size, descending. So now I can see all my databases, how big they are in megabytes, and I can see where all my bloat is. So obviously the bloat's in this first one here. So now what I want to do is take that and figure out, okay, what are the heavy site collections that are in there. So SB, so this time I'm going to use get SB content database so I can provide just a specific database name. I'm going to pipe that to get SP site. So I want to say give me all the site collections in that content database. If you have more than 200, I think the limit is, you need to pass a limit parameter and with the value of all if you want to get them all back. And this time what I want is the URL. And again, if I use the get member command that I could see on the site, there's a property called usage. So if I look at what that looks like, okay, so that's not all that useful, right? So usage is a complex type. There's properties off of that I'm actually looking for. So if I drill down further into that type, you'll see there's a storage property, and that gives me the actual size of it. So again, if I change this, let me move this back to the top so you can see it better. So that means I'm going to have to use another expression to get at that, because I can't do just usage.storage here. That's not going to work. So again, quick expression, and give it a script block. Usage.storage. My fingers are failing me. All right, and again, I'm going to sort it by size, descending. Right, oops, and what I forgot to do here was my little math calculation, so divide that by 1 megabyte. All right, so now I can see that I've got this one site, B20, that is 156 meg in size. So obviously my sites are kind of small. This is just a demo machine, but it gives you the general idea. So now what I can do is I can drill further into that and say, okay, well, how big are some of my lists? Now, I can't get the file size easily, so I do have something that will show how to get those results per item, and then you could take that and manipulate it a little bit further to figure out basically how big a particular document library is. But for simplicity's sake, I just want to know how many items are in each list. So if I got a list with 100,000 items, I want to know about that. So now what I'm going to do is get my site collection. And I'm going to do a different one here, just because there's a smaller set of information to come back. And I want to get all the webs. Right? So I'm saying, give me the site collection, PPC UK. Give me all the webs within that site collection, so the site objects, SP web objects. And now I'm going to use another commandlet called the for each object commandlet. So I can alias that using the % symbol. I can alias it using for each, or I can use it, alias it, or use the actual commandlet name, which is for each object. For stuff like this, I usually just use the % sign. It's just an alias that represents for each object. So again, this is just a commandlet I'm piping the values into. And here, I want to get all the lists. So what this is going to do is, so for each web, give me the list collection, and what that'll do is output that list collection to the pipeline. So now my next line is going to be processing on each list in each web in that site collection. So, and what I want is, I can say the title and item count. So you can see here, and again, I can sort that. Sort by item count, descending. All right, so now I can see how many items in each list. Now, of course, this is multiple webs. Title's not all that useful. I can use another expression to go ahead and get the server relative URL to that list instead of the title. So, and actually, you can save me some typing. You can see what that looks like here. So it's just another select, expression, current object. To get the URL, you need the root folder property of that list, and then I get the server relative URL. So as you start working with this, you can see that you really need to understand the API to a degree. So the commandlets are going to get you so far, but to really leverage PowerShell, you got to know what you can do with the commandlet, because a lot of this information is not all that obvious. The URL to a list, you'd expect just a simple URL property on the SP list object. There isn't one. So you need to drill down in order to get something. And even then, this isn't the full URL, it's server relative. If you want to get the full URL, you've got to do some additional work to make that happen. So, all right, so my next example. So my daughter started coming to London. I got to get some sort of Harry Potter reference. This is the best I got. So, Voldemort, right, compliance officer. So I had a couple compliance officers in previous lives that remind me a lot of this. So and I thought the pose and everything was quite fitting. So anyway, so you want to get an inventory of every document in your document library. So this is one of the things I've actually blogged about in my blog. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this for because I am already running a little behind. So what I do want to do is just show you the code and just kind of briefly here, just so that you can see that it can be done. So all I've done here is created a function. I'm looping through all my site collections, all the webs, all the lists, kind of like what I did through the pipeline, but here I'm doing it with an actual loop construct. The reason being is because what I eventually want to do is loop through all the items, and here's where I'm building that hash table and add in the relevant properties. I pivot it using the new object, PS object, dispose, and then in this case I'm outputting it to a grid view. So actually if I run this really quick, you can see I got a nice little grid view with all the information there. I can rearrange the columns, filter the columns, do some additional processing, or I can also use the export CSV commandlet and dump that out to an Excel file, which I can then hand off to my compliance officer, and he can do whatever he wants to. So you can very easily modify the script to limit it to scope, to add additional properties, to rather than just dump all the information, count up all the different file sizes to tell me how big the files are in aggregate, and output that information. So with very little effort, you can do quite a bit with this as sort of a framework. So again, this is on my blog, and I actually, when I blogged about it, I did it after 2010 was released with an intent for 2010, but I wrote it in such a way it'll work with 2007 as well. So you can use the same thing on 2007. All right, so any Tropic Thunder fans in here? No? Okay. So the joke with him might be lost then. But anyways, so your CEO comes in and you've given your devs, went on vacation, gave them domain admin rights so they could run the shop for you, and next thing you know, the company financials are out on the web and they're asking for raises and, devs, right? So I say this because I'm a dev, so I can tease devs in an admin talk. So ultimately, you want to find out what access do people have? How did they get that access? Who can see what? So this is another one that I've blogged about, and it's actually the other three that I have not. So I'm going to go kind of quick on this, and this one actually is a somewhat advanced one, but I show it just to kind of give you an idea of some of the power that you've got here. So this is using virtually no SharePoint commandlets. It's leveraging the API. Specifically, when you look at the API, there's an SP web, SP list item. These are what's known as securable objects. They implement a particular interface. On that interface, I have one rather useful method called get user effective permission info. If I call this guy, I can get a whole mess of information about how this user has access to this item, if they have access. The trick is there's a lot of unwinding you got to do to figure out what the information needs. So again, if you're a developer, you might be familiar with some of this, but ultimately what you're doing is going back and getting the role assignments, role definitions, and kind of backing out to get these actual names. So what you have in the user permission object that's created is a whole mess of references to other things. So the trick is getting those references and figuring out what they mean. So again, I got a fairly detailed blog about how this works. I just wanted to show it and kind of to point out that it's fairly, it's one of the more complex things that you can do, but fairly easy in that using this little function that I've created, and this actually shows an example of a function that leverages the pipeline. So I can pipe a user into it. Actually, not a user, but a securable object, and get all this information out. So you can make your functions look and work just like commandlets, and I can get quite a bit of information. And if I run this, so actually, if I come down to here, so here's an example of how I'm using this. So I'm basically passing in my webs, list items, dumping all that out to the pipeline, and then putting that in a grid view. So when I run it, I get this nice little display showing, again, who has access, so what the user is, what resource it is they're accessing, what the type is, whether it's a web list, document library, what level of access they have, and how they were given access. Was it direct? Was it through a SharePoint group, or was it through an AD group? So, and again, the way this function is written, I can reduce that so I can say, this user, what does he have access to within the farm? Or just limit it to a specific web or list or whatever, and who has access to it. So a script like this is very handy to have around when CEO comes calling. So, but if you're going to run it on your whole farm, like I just did here, go in everything, items, run off hours, because it'll definitely impact your database quite a bit. So I don't recommend running it on the whole farm. All right. So that's my reporting stuff. Anybody have any questions before I move on? Yeah, it'll hit central admin as well. So there are certain things like service applications where you got permissions and that kind of stuff. It doesn't do that, but if you look at just the groups, so it treats central admin just like any other site collection. So there is a farm admin group within central admin, so you can see who's a member of that. But when you get into the service applications, it's not going to tell you that. But it's not all that difficult to get that information as well. So, well, it is if you don't know the API, but it is. It's not that hard. It's actually easier to unwind those permissions because there's just one effectively one object that you call. It gets back a permission object that you can then output and whatnot. So. All right, so maintenance tasks. So yeah, I always have these same end users in my previous jobs. They would always be the same group of people, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, subset of people that were always putting in tickets with errors. Oh, crap. Sorry about that. In my rush to get up here, because there was no time between the session, I guess I forgot to plug in. We're good. Because once that pops up, there's just like seconds before it dies. This thing is a bit of a beast. Okay, so end users. So yeah, errors. So you guys have probably been working with 2010 a lot. You've seen the little error screen, correlation ID. Okay, so how do I find that, right? So some of you may have gone in and scoured the ULS logs, or if you got a farm with 20 servers in it, which server triggered the error? How do you figure that out? So sometimes you'll get lucky, but or maybe you got a small farm, not as big a deal. But there's two commandlets that can help you out here, and I actually combine the use of these commandlets, it's sometimes usually just one of them, with ULS Viewer. So great tool if you're not already using it. So let's look at this here. All right, so I've got a slight technical issue with my farm. I can't generate errors from any of my content web applications, which is I view it as a feature, but so no errors will show up in my ULS logs on any app other than Central Admin. So if you're wondering why I'm doing this from Central Admin, that's why. So, but my ULS logs, they stay nice and small. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to trigger an error. So I'm going to do a little parameter tamper in here and just change the field name to address, and that gives me your standard error, right? So this is something your end users may see. They may send you a screenshot, email. Hopefully, if not, you're a little bit more trouble. But so what I'm going to do is copy this GUID out and come down here. So I have this commandlet called getSPLog event. So you can see I got a few parameters that can pass in here, but there's nothing for a correlation ID. So there's a context key parameter here, which where is it? Right here. Yeah, I've been working with Microsoft to try to understand how this works. Nobody knows. So, I mean, they understand how it's supposed to work, but it doesn't work. So the idea is it's supposed to bring back user contextual information. What site were they on when they triggered the error? That kind of stuff. Who was the user? It doesn't work. So if you're able to get it work, please send me an email, because I've been working with some pretty sharp people at Microsoft and nobody knows. So anyways, so that doesn't help me with the correlation ID. So what I need to do is basically take the result and pass that into the where object command. I'm going to filter the list of events by the correlation key. The trick is you don't want to pull all the events back, because there could be thousands, hundreds of thousands in there. So best practice, always use the start and end time, at least the start time if you know it just happened, parameters. So I'm going to say getSPLog event, start time, and I can enter in a string. So I can say, what is today's date? 4/11. And I know it happened at 7:12 a.m. So on this machine at least. Or I can also provide an actual date object. So here I'm going to say end time is just now. But I could manipulate this. I could add time, add years, months, dates, whatever. So I can use an actual date object. And then I'm going to take that and filter it by, so there's a column called correlation, and this corresponds to the correlation ID. I want it to be equal to that GUID that we just pasted. All right. So So this is cool, except I can't read the message, right? My screen's too small. So what I really need is I can go ahead and select just the message, and that might give me a little bit more information, but it's still being trimmed. So there are some other formatting tricks you can do to actually see the whole message. There's something called format table, format list, and there's some properties that you can pass into that so that it won't cut off like it's done, whatnot. But typically, you're not going to know what machine this event occurred on. So most of you probably have a server farm with more than one server. So what I use in that case is merge SB log file. So actually, let me show you the help on that. So you can see the parameters here. Again, key thing, there's a start and end time somewhere in there. There's also, I can filter by category. But the cool thing is I also have a correlation key somewhere in here. Yeah, there it is. The trick is finding them. So it's in there, so I can actually, with this particular command, I can filter by the correlation key. You might also note that there is also a context filter and a exclude nested correlation. That's related to the context key thing that I said doesn't work. Yeah, same thing here. It's in there, but it doesn't work. So if I use this, and again, you want to provide a start date, and there's start time and end time. So here I'm just going to do get date, and I'm going to say add minutes, -10, because I'm pretty sure it was within 10 minutes. And I want the correlation ID to be that. And my path, I'm going to save it out to this file. Right? So it's going to bring up our nice little PowerShell progress bar. So at this point, it's going throughout your entire farm, looking at all the log files, aggregating the data within the window that I specified, and saving that to this local path. So I don't have to touch those files manually anymore. Now, if you're bringing back a lot of data, if you got a lot of farms, this could take quite a while. So obviously, I got one server. Didn't really take very long, right? And if I look at those results now, so now I can actually see the full message. But what I like to do is actually not look at it in Notepad, but use ULS Viewer. So I can come in here, open from File, and open that. And now I can see the message a little clearer. So there's additional filtering I can do and whatnot. So here I've only got 4 events, so not a big deal, but there's some events that will bring back just dozens and dozens of records and whatnot. So using this tool makes it a little easier to process those results. I was having a hard time finding a good picture for this. I actually had, I used to work for GTE, it's an old telephone company, now Verizon, and I got called up for one of these because the senior VP broke his cup holder. So anyways, recovery, backup, restore, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of you have probably seen the basic example, backup SP site, and back up a site collection, restore that. Great, 2010, I can do this now with webs and lists, right? So I had webs before, and I also have lists. Key thing is if you want to back up and restore a list, it's still import or export SP web and import SP web. They got lazy, so I just have an extra parameter on those commandlets. The core code is the same, so they figured why not just add a parameter to it. But it gets confusing because a lot of people don't realize that you can export and import lists with 2010 through PowerShell. I think you have to go through Central Admin to do it. It's only because there is no export SP list, right? So it's just the export SP web commandlet. So let's come back to our little demo, and I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to show. I was planning on going through this one step at a time, but I'm just going to kind of walk you through this script real quick here. So the trick is somebody has deleted a site, you need to get it back, a site collection site, whatever. You don't want to have a whole recovery farm. In 2007, that was common practice, right? You'd create a whole farm, maybe just been one server, but just so that you could restore your database, so you could go in and do your backup and restore and all that. 2010 is great. I can do a detached, an unattached content database restore. So to do that, I need to get a reference to my database here. So what I'll do is I'll paste it in here so you can see what that looks like. All right, so now I have a reference to my database. Notice that it says SharePoint Administration Web Application. When you attach the content database, it associates it with Central Admin. You're not going to see it within the Central Admin site, but in order to give the commands and everything context, all the URLs, everything are relative to the Central Admin site. So this is important when you start actually trying to grab an SP site object out of it. So now if I look at this code here, let me go and run that. So what I've done there is setting a variable called restored site. I'm passing that database that I just created into my getSPSite commandlet. And here I could have passed in the URL using the central admin URL. So what I wanted is the sites/BPC UK, but I did it this way instead. So one or the other would have worked. The key point being that I wanted to emphasize the fact that the URL is not going to be the same as it was in the original site. It's all relative to the central admin site, which is where it starts getting important to not create sites and site collections inside the central admin web application. So once I have that, now I can run my standard backup. I think this might give me an error because I already did this and I forgot to delete the file. So, but the point is I can run my standard backup SPSite command, pass in the restored site, give it a path. So if I added a force parameter there, it would overwrite that file. But when I was rehearsing this earlier, I forgot to delete it. So get rid of that error. All right, so the next thing, so that's great for a site collection. I got my back file, all right, and I can then use the restore SPSite and I can restore it. So it's just like we did in 2007, except we're using a PowerShell commandlet instead. So when we're talking the web, a subweb, a site within a site collection now, I've got the export SP web commandlet. So here I've got this site called the sites BPC UK PS for admins. And let's say my user has deleted that site. Now I need to recover it. So once I go and reattach my database somewhere, and I meant to show that. So here's my database, right? So I just took a backup of my content database and just restored it to a database with a different name. I can then go ahead and use the export SPWeb commandlet to get that. And here I'm just dumping it out, no file compression, anything, and you can see what that looks like. It takes just a second to run, but you'll see a path up here. So here I can see all my recovered files. So now that I have it exported, I can go ahead and import it into the site collection. With 2007, I could just import this directly. A site did not have to actually exist. With 2010, you do need a site already created. But you be careful about this. So you have the new SPWeb commandlet, and that's what I'll use to actually go ahead and create that site. So call it just a placeholder site. There is a template parameter that you can specify on there to go ahead and have it create the appropriate list and all that kind of stuff. Don't ever use that if you're going to import into it. It's got to be a blank site. So you can set the URL, you can set the parameter here about the top nav. There's also one for the quick launch. You can set the title and description, that kind of stuff. But do not set the template parameter. Your import will fail, and it may actually succeed initially, but you'll get runtime issues later. So that's kind of a key thing to remember. Once you've done that, I can go ahead and import it, and it'll run just fine. So I'm not going to run these because I haven't deleted the site. So, but you would see it pop up, and everything would be happy. All right, so my last example. So you're getting pretty good at PowerShell now. I can do this, blindfolded. So now you want to go ahead and do some security management. So I've got to go ahead and add a whole mess of users throughout a bunch of site collections, or create a standard group and add some users to that group throughout a bunch of site collections or whatever. So you want to automate some common tasks. You think, great, PowerShell, there's all these cool user-related commandlets like new SP user and get SP user and stuff like that for manipulating users. It's great, but I need to do groups. There's nothing. There are no commandlets for group management. So what I did is I put together another script here. So my little part of a script library, if you will, that basically creates a series of functions that mimic what should be out of the box. So basic stuff: get a group, remove a group, right? Add permissions to a group, create a group, and sync SP user. I'll talk about that in a sec, right? So some common stuff, right? So with this, and then with the out-of-the-box user-related commandlets, now I can do bulk user security-related operations, right? So if I've got maybe a web application devoted to team sites, and I need to add a new special purpose group in there across all my site collections. Maybe I've got hundreds of them, and I need to add this one AD user or group or whatever to all those. I don't want to do that point and click. So with this, I can get the list of all my site collections for that web app, pipe them into a little loop that then calls my new SP group function here, and then use some properties on that group to simply add the user right in. So really, really easy to do with PowerShell in batch. So I'm not going to walk through all of this. One thing I did want to point out is you're not limited to the base types. So a lot of the PowerShell commandlets use these things called pipe bind objects. So when I create or use the get SP site commandlet, I can pass in an URL. I can pass in a GUID representing the ID of that site. I can pass in a URI. I can actually pass in an SP site object itself, so I can get a new instance of that. Well, I can use these in my scripts as well. So within my function, by using this type here, I can call this function and pass in an actual SP web object or just the URL to it. So that makes my scripts a lot more flexible, if you will. So the other thing I wanted to point out here, so there's this, this set SP user commandlet is a built-in commandlet, so out of the box, and it has this really cool parameter here, sync from AD. So how many of you with 2007 had somebody get married, change their name, and now all of a sudden all your sites reflect the old name, and they're not so happy about that, right? So you got to fix that. So with this here, running that commandlet will fix that. It'll resync all that information with AD. So what I did is I wrapped this in a nice little function where I could pass in just a username. So who is it that I want to sync with? And this guy's going to blow through all of my site collections, look at whether or not it's claims or not, and do the appropriate logic to get the correct user credential type or user object type. And then it's going to just run this set SP user commandlet. So it's a pretty simple commandlet, but by wrapping it like this, now I can do it in bulk on a whole lot of site collections. So, and of course, we're cleaning up after ourselves there. All right. So I think I got like 2 minutes to cover remoting. So I'm going to probably go over just a few minutes here into the break. But if you guys have any questions, I'll hang around afterwards, and probably in the hall or whatever, so we're not interrupting the next session. But definitely feel free to ask. So, all right. So PowerShell Remoting works with V2 only. This is a great way to allow people like developers access to your SharePoint environment without making them local admins, without giving them the right or ability to log in interactively. So core requirement of PowerShell is I got to log in interactively, right? Well, if I'm using Remoting, I don't. So enabling Remoting, pretty easy. There's actually a simple command that you can run called enable PS Remoting. You're going to run this on the client and the server. You're going to get prompted a couple times to confirm you want to do this. There are some ways on the server where you can reduce the security footprint, a little bit more advanced. I actually have a whole 30-somewhat page chapter in my book that talks about how to do all this and gets into some of the ways that you can reduce that footprint. But the easiest way is just simply run enable PS Remoting, both sides. The other thing is you need to enable CredSSP, so the Credential Security Support Provider. So this is, in a sense, like Kerberos, works nothing like Kerberos, but it solves the same problem. It's a double hop issue. So when your credentials get passed to the remote machine, how do those credentials get passed to SQL Server, the back-end sources, right? If you are not connecting using CredSSP, some commandlets will work, but most won't. You'll get security issues, right? So, and I'll show you how to enable that in the next slide here. But the other thing you need to do is increase the max memory per shell megabyte. So this is a setting that the WS management shell exposes. So you're going to say how much memory is available for the session that gets created on the remote server. However, if you increase that, then I recommend you decrease these values here. Because the default is 5, so the max shells per user. So how many remote sessions can I have running on that server? And then how many concurrent users are available? So if I leave the default as 5 and 5, and I have basically 25 sessions that get spawned, so maybe you got a lot of people connecting to that server for some reason, and I did in fact bump this setting up, the max memory per shell, and I got 25 gig worth of PowerShell sessions going on. So you're going to quickly bring your machine to its knees. So first off, only allow it on sort of an application server, not one of your web front ends unless you have to. And if you do, then drop these levels down even more. So just one user at a time maybe. But on your back end, your application server, this is kind of what I recommend is the setting. So reduce that footprint. If you can go lower, then great. So if you lower these to, say, just to 1 and 1, then you might be able to increase the memory. So it really just kind of depends on how much of an impact you want to have on that server. So a lot of people talk about increasing this first item, but nobody addresses those. So enabling CRED SSP. So again, this is pretty easy. You basically enable it through the group policy, but the easiest way is there's a command called enable WSMan CRED SSP. You're going to pass in a role. So on the client machine, you're going to pass in a role with a value of client. And I kind of wrapped at an unfortunate place, but the computer you're going to delegate to, and here you specify the name. So you can specify a specific machine name, a wildcard, so like star.aptilon.com, or just star if you want to allow remote access to all machines. And then on the server, this is all you need to run. Just enable WSMan CRED SSP role server. So if you don't do that, enable that, you're not going to have full access to the commandlets. All right, so when it comes to running remote commands, the first couple things are common. There's two different approaches, basically. The first couple steps are going to be common. You need to get your credentials. So who are you going to connect as, right? So you need a credential object, and you use the get credential commandlet to do that. And you can see on line 2, both of these examples where I'm doing that. That's going to bring up a security prompt where I can type in the username and password. It stores it in that variable. The next thing I need to do is create a session object and store that in a variable. So a new PS session, I give it the name of the computer I want to connect to, the authentication mechanism I want to use, so here CRED SSP, the credentials I want to use. So again, that's going to be the same for both approaches. Right? So what that does, as soon as I've run that, I've now spawned a session on the remote machine. So there's an active connection, and there's some polling and that kind of stuff going back and forth. So the easiest way, and this is the way I recommend you do it, is to use enter PS session. At that point now, I'm basically going to be stepping into that remote session, and I'm going to be operating just as though I'm on the machine. So my prompt is going to change to show me which computer I'm connected to. I'm going to have to load the command, the snap-in, because by default, that snap-in is not going to load. So anything you've done with a profile script on that server does not relate to this. Okay? There is a way to automatically load it, which I don't know if I got time to show, but anyways. So that's what I recommend doing. The reason being is that when you do that, you're not serializing the objects back and forth. So the next approach is you're going to use this invoke command. So here I'm still on my box, but I'm going to send the command to run, send whatever object. It's going to serialize all that information into the standardized XML structure, send it out to the server, do the process that it needs to do, serialize it back, send it to me. And yeah, so by doing that, though, what happens is certain complex types, for instance, that SP site object I showed earlier, the usage property was a complex type. If I said get SP site on here, what I would get back is for usage is a string with a type name. I'd have no access to the values of that because it only serializes one level deep. So if you just need to do a quick check or whatever, this will work fine, but I always recommend do this. It's much better. The other thing here is everything is in invoke command, but so you can load your snap-in, and then what you can do is I can import the session. So I can say, I want to go ahead and import all those commandlets that are available in that session and make them available on my local session. So when I type I can, from there, just type get SP site. And behind the scenes, this guy, this command, the import PS session, is going to create a script module with a whole mess of functions, a function for every commandlet. So if I were to crack open that script module, I'll actually see a function called getSPSite that behind the scenes is running invoke command. Okay. So there's a lot of overhead involved with that. The trick is, though, with this guy here, the way I've formatted this command, this is wrong. This is going to import everything, all the commandlets that are available, including the out-of-the-box ones, get, process, help, all that kind of stuff. What you want to do is there's a module parameter that you can provide. So what I would do is tack on dash module and then the name of the snap-in that I want. I always recommend you do that. Because this tripped me up once because I imported like this. I typed directory, expecting to have access to my files, and I was getting the directory on the remote server. So it makes you think that you've done this, that you've entered the remote server. Well, it's not true. And now it's even harder for me. Usually the reason you do this is so that if you've got local variables or script files that you need to run, do something with, you can do them using this approach. But if you import everything, you've just overwrote all your out-of-the-box local commandlets. So those files that you were trying to access don't exist anymore because it's going to try to get them on the server. So use this if you need to access remote local files, local variables, or scripts that you've already defined in your session. But make sure you provide the module parameter and only import the PowerShell, the SharePoint PowerShell commandlets. And I don't have time to show this, but I just want to mention it. By default, when you connect, it's going to use a standard configuration. Right? This configuration requires local admin rights. So if you set up remote and everything's great, and you try to connect, it's going to give you access denied, and you're not an administrator, you can say, like, Gary said you didn't need local admin. Well, with the default, you don't. Or you do, rather. So you can use, on the server, you can run it's called the register PS session. So register-ps is in PowerShell session. And you can pass in a name, a startup script. So I usually pass in the path to the SharePoint PS1 script that I pointed out at the very beginning. And you need to specify the thread options. So the thread options that are set through that script do not take effect because you don't have a host. So you need to explicitly set the thread options when you call this commandlet. And then once you have that, there's another commandlet called set PS session configuration. And on that is a parameter. I can probably just do the help on here real quick. So there's a parameter on here called show security descriptor. You can use this, and when you hit that, it'll bring up a little security dialog, and you can specify who has access to that configuration. So I mentioned earlier about creating multiple groups or one or more groups for assigning shell access rights. Well, at that point, you could go ahead and add that group to the descriptor here. And then you could, if you wanted to, you could alter the descriptors for the out-of-the-box ones, remove them entirely, whatever. So then to use this configuration, when I create my session, there's a configuration parameter. All you need to do is just specify the name of the configuration, and that's it. So I mentioned earlier also that you could go ahead and restrict the commandlets that are available. It's a little bit more advanced. I do have an example in my book, which will be out next month. So if you want to see what that looks like, just grab me afterwards, and I can show you the pre-worked copy of that. It hasn't gone through the production layout on it yet, but yeah. So. All right, so key takeaways, learn PowerShell, get comfortable with the API, the SharePoint API. It's definitely not just for devs. So a lot of what I showed is using the API, not just the out-of-the-box commandlets. And yeah, buy my book. It's my first writing endeavor, and it was a beast. So I'm not saying it's great, but hopefully it'll any PowerShell questions it'll answer. So there's a lot in there on PowerShell 101. I've got 100-something chapters just to get you up to speed, or pages rather, on PowerShell. That's a big book. Also, if you're doing any provision in a SharePoint, so you want to, everybody familiar with AutoSP installer? Yeah, okay, so compared to what I cover in the book, the thing's like a toy. So again, I've got every single service application is covered with scripts and examples, how to configure all of them. So if you're doing any sort of provisioning with PowerShell, we cover the entire gambit of setup and deployment and that kind of stuff, all through PowerShell. There's stuff in there on multi-tenancy, remoting, creating custom commandlets, so the stuff that I'll be doing tomorrow, a ton of stuff. So if you go to my blog, there's a link on there. It's not out yet, but it is available for sale, so I had to offer that up. If you're interested in hear more about Aptalon, so these are the guys that make up Aptalon. Maurice and Matt are here speaking this week as well. So if you have any questions or deployment, development, whatever needs, definitely come and talk to us. And that's it. So.